1950s America, on the surface. It shimmered with the bright lights of the American dream. But beneath lay the darkness of hidden forces manipulating the economy, politics, and society. There, the Italian Mafia were not just killers, they were financial architects operating in the shadows. Black gangs were not merely street criminals but the byproduct of a deeply unjust society. Biker gangs were more than outlaws, they stood as symbols of rebellion against the system. But who truly controlled America during that era? Who was the most powerful force? And is what we know about them the truth? Or just the stories the media wanted us to believe? 1950s America, a nation caught between two worlds. On one side, the light of progress, bustling streets, towering skyscrapers, and the American dream promising success to anyone willing to work hard. But on the other, beneath that glamorous facade, lay a world governed by different rules, a world of those who refused to obey the law. Those who lived in the shadows yet controlled far more than people imagined. Gangs in this era were no longer just small-time criminals. They were no longer mere drifters robbing on the streets. They had evolved into organizations with deep influence, clear strategies, and real power. The Italian Mafia, black gangs, and outlaw biker groups, each had its own way of growing, its own path to power. But they all shared one common goal: control. Control over money. Control over people, control over the darkest corners of America. But what allowed them to rise? What determined the strength of each organization? And most importantly, who held the greatest influence? To answer these questions, we must turn back time, returning to the golden age of America's underworld. The Italian Mafia was not just a criminal organization but an entire system operating like an empire. Originating from Sicilian mafia families, they brought with them omerta, the code of absolute silence, and built a tightly structured network from the early 20th century. But it was in the 1950s that they truly expanded, becoming the dominant underground force controlling many sectors of America. Unlike reckless street gangs, the Mafia did not rely solely on violence. They used strategy. They built an organizational model similar to a financial corporation. Every decision had to go through a strict hierarchy, from the boss to the capos and down to the soldiers. Emotions had no place in their business. A hit order was never made out of personal hatred but from necessity. Betrayal always meant death. But the most terrifying aspect of the Italian Mafia was not their guns, but their ability to infiltrate every aspect of society. They didn't rob businesses, they controlled labor unions, took over construction and transportation industries, and even influenced politics. They offered protection to businesses, but not in the way common loan sharks did. If a business refused to pay for their protection, they didn't need to issue direct threats. A well-organized strike was enough to bring the company to its knees. If a politician refused to cooperate, all it took was a few scandals to be exposed, and his career would be over. This is what set the Mafia apart from other gangs. They didn't fight in the streets, they fought in the shadows. They didn't need to pull the trigger to gain control, they used money, connections, and careful planning. This raises a question: was the Mafia just a criminal organization? Or had they become a part of America's power structure? Meanwhile, another force was rising, but through a completely different path. Black gangs did not emerge from long-standing traditions like the Mafia but from social injustice. In the 1950s, African Americans were still excluded from the economic system, oppressed by the police, and isolated in neglected neighborhoods. When society offered them no opportunities, they had to create their own. At first, organizations like the Black Mafia and the Chicago Vice Lords were formed to protect their communities. They stood against racism, providing a sense of security for people abandoned by law enforcement. But then, power and money changed everything. The same organizations that once stood for protection gradually became forces of control, enforcing their rule over their neighborhoods using the very tactics they once opposed. While the Mafia expanded its power by seizing legitimate industries, black gangs took a different path: drugs and weapons. This was the biggest difference between the Italian Mafia and black gangs. One operated like a financial empire, while the other fought for control on the streets. The Mafia could manipulate the law through money, but black gangs had to fight against it. This led to higher levels of violence among black gangs. If the mafia killed for strategic reasons, black gangs fought over territory. And because of that, they became a primary target for the government. This raises another debate. Were black gangs truly criminals? Or were they just the result of an unjust society? If African Americans had been given equal opportunities, would these organizations have ever existed? And then, there was another force, one that did not care about politics or power. They didn't seek to control the economy or represent any social movement. They wanted only one thing: absolute freedom. These were the outlaw biker gangs. Many of them were World War II veterans who returned from battle and found no meaning in post-war life. They felt lost in a society full of rules and restrictions. And so, they created their own world, brotherhoods that lived by their own laws. But this freedom quickly transformed into something darker: violence, smuggling, and crime. Unlike the mafia, which had a strict organizational structure, and black gangs, which had political and social roots, biker gangs operated under a much simpler rule: power decides everything. They controlled bars, towns where the police dared not interfere. They smuggled weapons, organized illegal races, and were willing to kill to protect their territory. But were they really criminals? Or were they just rebels fighting against a society they could never fit into? Were they truly dangerous, or simply men searching for a place to belong? Three forces, three different paths, but all leading to the same question: who truly dominated the American underworld? Money is what determines everything. No matter how strong or ruthless an organization is, without a stable financial foundation, it will quickly collapse. Power in the underworld is not created by guns but by controlling the hidden flow of money in the economy. And in 1950s America, gangs discovered different ways to get rich, each method reflecting their very nature. The Italian Mafia, the financial masterminds of the shadows, did not make money through robbery but by manipulating legitimate industries. Black gangs, those who lived in abandoned slums, had no choice but to exploit what was most accessible: drugs, weapons, and quick but highly risky transactions. And the outlaw biker gangs? They did not have the structured system of the mafia, nor the massive consumer market of the black gangs. But they had recklessness, and sometimes, recklessness was the most profitable asset. But who was the best at making money? Who was the wealthiest force in the American underworld at that time? The Italian Mafia had long understood that the most sustainable way to make money was not through robbery or selling illegal goods but by controlling legitimate businesses from the inside. Why risk smuggling drugs when they could make millions from casinos, restaurants, and labor unions? If street gangs had to kill each other over every street corner, the Mafia only needed to bribe the right people to control an entire city. Gambling was the Mafia's money printing machine. It was no coincidence that Las Vegas, the gambling capital of America, flourished during this period. Mafia bosses realized that a legal casino could launder money, manipulate profits, and most importantly, never be targeted by the police. They did not just run casinos but also controlled loan sharking, ensuring that anyone who stepped into the world of gambling would be trapped in an endless cycle of debt. But the Mafia did not stop there. They knew that to protect their profits, they needed to control labor unions. If a construction company wanted to operate without facing strikes, they had to pay the Mafia. If a transportation company wanted to ensure their goods were not blocked by protests, they also had to pay. These were not small-scale deals but multi-million-dollar agreements, executed without a single piece of paperwork but carrying more weight than any official law. The most terrifying part? The Mafia did not need to use violence to make threats. They threatened with economic power. If a business refused to cooperate, they didn't need to pull the trigger. All they had to do was drive up material costs or organize a controlled strike, and the business would crumble. So, were the Mafia truly criminals? If looked at from another perspective, they resembled an unofficial financial system, a shadow government that operated more efficiently than the legal one. And if that was the case, how could they ever be eradicated? Meanwhile, the black gangs did not have the advantages of the Mafia. They had no political connections and no way to legalize their operations. But they had one thing: drugs. The 1950s marked a major shift in American society. Before that, drugs were considered a luxury of the upper class. But during this period, they began spreading into the working class. And the black gangs quickly realized that this was a market they could fully control. No need for complex organizational systems or long-term strategies, just a few loyal members. A handful of street corners. And the market would expand on its own. But drugs were also a double-edged sword. Unlike the mafia's casinos or labor unions, which could be sustainably controlled, the drug market was constantly changing. And anyone who controlled it had to face unpredictable dangers. If the mafia could maintain power without exposing themselves, black gangs had to constantly fight to defend their territory. A street corner could change ownership overnight. A betrayal could collapse an entire drug network. A police raid could wipe out a gang's entire supply in an instant. So the question arises, did the US government truly want to eliminate the drug trade? Or did they simply want to control it? Because there was a frightening truth, black gangs controlled the streets. But they were not the ones importing the drugs. Behind them, there were always bigger forces, sometimes the mafia, sometimes even more mysterious organizations. And what about the biker gangs? They did not have the mafia's structured organization, nor did they have a vast market like the black gangs. But they had one unique advantage: they were not bound by any rules. They did not control labor unions or run casino rackets, but they knew how to profit from chaos. Gun smuggling became one of their primary sources of income. They were not weapons manufacturers or financial masterminds, but they were the ones willing to transport illegal goods to places where law enforcement could not reach. Unlike the mafia, who thrived in secrecy, biker gangs did not hide their existence. They did not bribe officials but instead directly confronted the police. This made them harder to eliminate than even the mafia, because an organization built on money can be destroyed by cutting off its finances. But an organization built on loyalty and violence could neither be bribed nor eradicated by ordinary law enforcement. So in the end, who was the most powerful force? The Italian Mafia, with their sophisticated economic operations? The black gangs, with their high-risk drug empire? Or the outlaw biker gangs, who feared no authority? There was no absolute answer. But one thing was certain: no one could make money in the underworld without sacrificing something. For the mafia, it was absolute control. For the black gangs, it was survival on the streets. For the biker gangs, it was freedom, the one thing they were willing to die for. There is nothing more terrifying than a force that can control money, politics, and society. But there is one thing even more powerful than power and violence: how the world perceives them. Because if an organization can control its image, make the public love them, admire them, or fear them so much that no one dares to resist, then they have already won without firing a single shot. The Italian Mafia, black gangs, and biker gangs were not just criminal organizations. They were symbols, stories, legends that the media had etched into the minds of all of America. But the question is, who really controlled their image? Did they create it themselves? Or was it the media that shaped these figures? There is a thought-provoking truth: while the police, the government, and American society sought to eliminate gangs, it was the media that turned them into figures the public could not look away from. The Italian Mafia, with all its assassinations, million-dollar schemes, and intricate financial networks, should have been seen as the most feared criminals in America. But instead, they became a symbol of power in the shadows, of honor, of men who lived by their own code, even outside the law. This was no coincidence. Hollywood played a crucial role in romanticizing the mafia. If people feared the mafia, they would fight against them. But if people admired them, they would never want to destroy them completely. Look at films like The Godfather, Goodfellas, Casino. They did not just depict the mafia as criminals, but as intelligent, sophisticated figures with principles. They did not kill for pleasure, they killed for business, for honor, for a code of ethics that the government could never understand. But what was the truth? Did the mafia truly have honor? If a traitor was executed, was it really because of the code? Or was it just a method of control? If they protected their families, did that make them men of loyalty? Or was it simply a way to enforce obedience within their ranks? The media created an illusion that the mafia were different from ordinary murderers. That they were more respectable, more intelligent, that they had their own rules of the game. But looking directly at the reality, was that truly honor? Or just a way to legitimize violence? Meanwhile, black gangs had a completely different media journey. If the mafia was romanticized, then black gangs were demonized, turned into the face of chaos, crime, and the destruction of society. 1950s American media was filled with reports of gang murders, violent purges, and streets flooded with drugs and guns. Films and newspaper articles of the time painted black gangs as the greatest threat to America. But was the reality that simple? If black gangs were truly the biggest threat, why didn't the government target the drug importers, the forces supplying the weapons? Why did they only focus on the street-level dealers? The question is, did the US government really want to eliminate black gangs? Or did they just want to control them? If the media could convince society that these gangs were the biggest problem, then no one would ask questions about who was truly behind the underground economy. What's interesting is that decades later, the image of black gangs changed. From being demonized by the media, they became icons in music, especially in hip-hop. Artists like Tupac, Biggie, NWA began using gang stories to tell the realities of street life. The things the government didn't want people to know. Was this a form of resistance? Or was it just another cycle, where those once labeled as criminals were turned into marketable products for the music industry? Biker gangs, on the other hand, had a completely different media portrayal. They were neither romanticized like the mafia nor demonized like black gangs. Instead, they became a cultural symbol, a part of the American spirit. The image of a bearded man, wearing a leather jacket, riding a Harley-Davidson down endless roads, it was not just the image of an outlaw, but the image of freedom, of men who rejected the system. Films like Easy Rider, The Wild One did not portray biker gangs as terrifying criminals. They were shown as men who lived by their own rules, those who refused to be bound by any laws. But was that the full truth? If they were just freedom-loving rebels, why did the FBI consider them among America's most dangerous organizations? If they weren't really criminals, why did they control networks of arms and drug trafficking? Maybe American society needed a figure like the biker gangs, not as terrifying as the mafia. Not as chaotic as black gangs, but just rebellious enough to inspire. Yet not dangerous enough to threaten the system. The Italian Mafia was romanticized. Black gangs were demonized. Biker gangs became symbols of freedom. But in the end, who really controlled this narrative? Was it the gangs themselves? Or was it the media and society that decided how we see them? If the mafia had never been glorified, would they have lasted this long? If black gangs had not been labeled the biggest threat, would the government have been able to use them as an excuse to control black communities? If biker gangs had been portrayed as they really were, would they still be symbols of freedom? The biggest question is, if the underworld has become part of pop culture, is it still truly the underworld? And if the media can control how we see these gangs, what else are they hiding? How much of this story is truth? And how much is just what they want us to believe? But one thing is certain. The underworld does not exist only on the streets. It exists in our minds, in what we hear, believe, and fear. The Italian Mafia infiltrated politics and manipulated the economy. Black gangs stirred up society and became tools in a much bigger power game. Biker gangs turned crime into a cultural movement. But did they truly control this world? Or were they merely pieces on an even greater chessboard? If real power does not belong to those who hold the guns but to those who control the narrative, then who is truly the strongest? Leave your thoughts below, hit like, and subscribe so you don't miss the hidden truths lurking behind the curtains of history.